G'day. So I'm going to start right at the very beginning. Burt Munro was conceived. Nah, I'm just kidding. He was born Herbert James Munro on the 25th of March 1899, and he was born a twin. But his twin sister died at birth. Burt himself wasn't even meant to live to the age of 2 years old, but he survived and grew up normal and healthy on farms around Edendale, which is 23 miles east of Invercargill in New Zealand. He attended Edendale Primary School. At Edendale Primary School, they encouraged their children to fulfil their dreams just as Burt did. His interest in speed and things which go fast began at an early age. I've seen it reported that the first bike Burt purchased was a Douglas, but this is simply not true. A Douglas was in fact the very first motorcycle that Burt ever rode. When he was 16 years old, he actually borrowed it from a neighbour, who later frequently loaned him the bike. The very first motorcycle that Burt actually purchased was a second-hand Clino in 1919, similar to the one pictured here. It had a sidecar, which was soon removed, and he began to enter his 6-horsepower V-twin in local New Zealand races. He sold this bike in 1920 to purchase the Indian Scout. This is the only picture I could find of Burt's bike in its original form before he started to strip it down and modify it. The true story about Burt and his bike is a lot more complicated than the movie The World's Fastest Indian portrayed, but I'll give it a go. Before I do, let's have a more detailed look at an Indian Scout, as they may have come from the factory in 1920. For its time, the Scout was quite an advanced design, with a side valve V-twin engine, the leather seat had springs to soften the ride somewhat, as there was no rear suspension. Chain final drive, this one has an electric light, but Burt's was acetylene because you guessed it, it was cheaper. They had a 3-speed gearbox with a hand change lever on the right hand side. A rear rack, front leaf spring suspension, no front brake, just a rear drum brake, which is pretty standard for the time, and the carburetor was a Chevrolet. No matter what you may have read, a 1920 Scout had an engine capacity of 596 cc's and produced 11.5 horsepower, and here's the proof. An original ad from Indian Motorcycle itself. The real saga began when Burt started to modify his bike in the mid-1920s. This consisted mainly of removing surplus items to reduce the weight, plus some alterations to the riding position. It was at this time when he also got married, and then they moved to Australia where their first 2 children were born. He raced speedway in Australia, but when the Great Depression struck, they moved back to New Zealand where they had another 2 children. By the early 1930s, Burt had changed the spark plug positions. He actually did this numerous times over the years. He'd modified the cams and changed the lubrication system, which improved his Scout side valve engine to a point where he was reaching speeds of 90 miles an hour. Then by the mid-1930s, he had converted the engine from the original side valve configuration to overhead valves, which meant he had to manufacture new heads, barrels and pistons. This is when he also started to first modify the frame. He added a front brake, changed the front suspension to girder forks, and began entering his bike in races as the Munro Special. By 1940, he was attaining speeds of 120 miles per hour. In the late 1940s, after his separation from his wife and his father passing away, he gave up his job to devote most of his time to working on his motorcycles. I don't wish to delve into Burt's personal life too much, as I'm not a gossip columnist, But I have no doubt that Burt's love for his motorcycles did contribute somewhat to his marriage breakdown. Living through the Great Depression with a young family, and with Burt spending money on motorcycles, I would imagine that there was at least some resentment there. He survived by living life very cheaply in his shed and doing any odd jobs which took his fancy to earn money. By this time, he had enlarged the capacity to 633 cc's, and his motor was producing around 50 horsepower, and he was reaching speeds of 130 miles an hour. During the 1950s, Burt spent many hours making pistons, conrods and flywheels, etc. Burt knew he was losing too much of his hard-earned horsepower due to the primary drive gears, so he changed it to a chain drive. To this day, a chain is still the most efficient means of transferring power. His bike was now up to 738 cc's, and he broke the 750cc class record in New Zealand with a speed of 143 miles per hour. In 1956, Burt visited the Bonneville salt flats for the very first time, as a spectator. He witnessed successful world record attempts by the NSU factory using streamliners. This is when he realised he needed a streamliner for his bike to get the full speed potential from all his tuning and modifications. He started working his own streamliner shell during 1957, hand beating the aluminium to the shape of a fish. He got the idea for this shape after watching fish swim in a goldfish pond. Burt only trialled this streamliner a few times because he found it too close to a fit and he couldn't properly control the bike, or even change the gears. However, he did attain a phenomenal speed of 160 miles an hour using it. But Burt was quickly running out of place in New Zealand where he could test his bike to its full potential, legally that is. The late 50s was also when an American motorcycle magazine spelled his name wrong, so Burt himself changed the spelling of his name from B-E-R-T to B-U-R-T. It was at this time when he started having his heart problems too. He then set about making another streamliner shell from fiberglass using the aluminium one as a mould, making it wider and longer. He added 3 small tail fins to improve the stability. However, the first time Burt was able to test this new fiberglass streamliner was at Bonneville itself in 1962. This was the year the movie was based on, when he suffered the bad crash and burned his leg on the exhaust. The scar was permanent, it was about ½ inch deep and the shape of the exhaust pipe. This was also the year when he unsuccessfully trialled the lead weight, which was placed in front of the rear wheel. When he arrived at Bonneville in '62, with his now 850cc Indian, what most people don't know is that his only intention was to give his Indian a high-speed run, to find out how fast she went. He had no intention of breaking any speed records. After unloading his bike and after eventually being allowed to go through tech inspection, he was advised his tyres would not pass, so Burt just positioned his bike in a way where the inspectors couldn't see the dodgy bits. Although I'm pretty sure the officials turned a blind eye on many occasions just to help him out. To the amazement of everybody there, Burt actually qualified with a speed of 174.75 miles per hour. So they asked him if he wanted to have a go at the 883cc class record. So the next day he did, and Burt's record-breaking speed that year was officially recorded at 178.971 miles an hour. The starting drill for the Munro Special was for Burt to put the bike in first gear and hold the decompression lever while being push-started, but this had to be quite a considerable speed, as the bike was very tall geared. Then Burt would release the decompression lever and the engine would fire up, with a mighty blast of power from its megaphone exhausts. A sound, by all reports, which would split your eardrums, and probably explains why old Burt was as deaf as a post. While I'm on the starting of his bike, I've got a bit of a story for you regarding the opening scene in the movie. When I say story, I don't mean bullshit, it's actually true. When Anthony Hopkins, who was not all that mechanically minded, wheeled the bike out of the shed to start it, he was only meant to blip the throttle a couple of times, just enough to wake the neighbours up. But instead, once it started, he held it wide open on full throttle, which sounded fantastic, but the engine was right on its limits. You can hear it in the movie scene. When Roger Donaldson, the director, asked the builder of the bikes, Wayne Alexander, what he thought, he replied, "Well, I wouldn't lend him my car." Everybody found this quite funny. Remember, both the bikes were near exact replicas with old Indian motors in them, so they were feeling pretty lucky they didn't actually blow it up. Anyway, after his successful 1962 trip, Burt took his whole bike back to New Zealand and set about rebuilding his motor and modifying a streamliner shell because he was certain that he hadn't got the best out of the bike. He modified his streamliner, making it longer, lowering the nose and replacing the tri-fin tail with a single larger fin similar to what's on an aircraft, in an attempt to make it more stable. This was also the time when he converted the engine from the original 2 cams, one for each cylinder, to a 4-cam configuration, one for each valve. which Burt himself estimated took him around 800 hours of work. This enabled him more finer tuning of the valves. He took his modified bike back to Bonneville in 1963, but suffered a very severe engine blow-up on his very first run, and the motor totally disintegrated, meaning any record-breaking attempts that year were finished. Later, back in New Zealand, he decided to make a lot more spare parts, all new valves, new cylinders, pistons, which increased the engine capacity even more. For 1964, the engine was now approaching 880cc, and Burt qualified with a very good speed of 184 miles an hour. Unfortunately, a severe rainstorm blew in and any actual record attempts weren't possible. He went back in 1965 with the engine now just over 900cc, which meant Burt was able to go into the 1000cc class for the first time. But it rained again and was another washout. 1966 was the year which saw this photo taken when Burt lifted his head up to slow down and stabilise the bike from the violent shaking he was experiencing. He was actually riding blind. Burt had to shut the power off partway through the measured mile, but ironically he still managed to break the 1000cc record that year with a speed of 168.066 miles per hour. Back in New Zealand he rebuilt the engine again, but the only frame he had for test runs in New Zealand was his Velocet's frame, as he left the streamliner and frame in America. Burt knew that he needed to make more changes to his streamliner to improve the high-speed stability. So on arrival in America and back at Sam Pearce's workshop in June '67, where his Indian frame and streamliner were kept, Burt set about modifying the streamliner for the second time. He cut this big hole in the front of the streamliner. When asked about the reasons for the hole by a reporter, Burt replied it was to cool the engine. But the actual reasons were much more fundamental than that. He couldn't be bothered explaining the reasons to a journalist, especially one who wasn't all that sure himself at the time. It was all to do with the centre of pressure, the centre of gravity and aerodynamic forces. He made a lead tube to fit inside the hole weighing around 36 pounds. This modification placed a lot more weight at the front with the centre of pressure much further back. According to Burt, it brought the centre of gravity to about 33% from the nose. He also had to fit a parachute, which was mandatory for 1967. The bike was now 953cc. His first couple of runs that year were pretty good, but yet again he suffered engine problems damaging pistons and valves, but fortunately by this time he had made himself plenty of spare parts and was able to repair the Indian. However, his newly modified streamliner performed much better, and on Saturday the 26th of August 1967, Burt completed 2 successful runs, breaking the world record with an average speed of 183.586 miles per hour. This figure was retroactively changed to 184.087 miles per hour in 2014 when Burt's son John noticed a calculation mistake, and this is a record that still stands today. On return to New Zealand, Burt proceeded to modify a different Scout frame which he had acquired, making it similar to the one in America, although not as long. As by this time he was sick and tired of having to dismantle his Velocet every time he was home, just to test his Indian motor. Burt had also built an electric starter with a Bendix drive so he could start the engine by himself, eliminating the need for a push start. He also built a paddle type dyno, and after his calculations were completed came up with a figure of 90 horsepower. As a side note for those interested, at top speed Burt's bike was at around 7,000 RPM. That's double what the original engine was designed to do. By the 1968 Bonneville trip, the bike was 965cc, but stormy weather made the course unusable and it was yet again another washout. 1969 was another disappointing year at Bonneville. Even though Burt recorded his highest ever qualifying speed of 191 miles an hour, he suffered more problems with the bike, this time the magneto, and didn't improve on his 1967 record. Back home in his shed, Burt was quite famous by this time and occasionally used to get visited by local bikers. Here's some extremely rare colour photos of the inside of his shed which were taken on one of those occasions. Burt was never one to give up, and once again he was back at Bonneville in 1970 with the bike now 985cc. He was quickly realising any time he had to improve on his world record was running out due to his age. so Burt decided to try nitro-based fuel instead of his usual methanol. This decision proved absolutely disastrous, resulting in numerous burnout pistons, meaning many more offerings to the god of speed. Nitro fuels will burn a piston out in a split second if the mixture is even slightly lean. In 1971, Burt again returned to Bonneville, but this time with a film crew to document his escapades. However, to Burt's dismay on arrival, he was informed of new rule changes, requiring streamlines to have insulated firewalls. Gone were the days when Burt's only protection was a cut-up asbestos electric blanket. He didn't have time to modify his shell, which meant he wasn't permitted to run in the same class his record was held in. They offered Burt a chance to run in the unstreamlined class. He gave it a go, but his bike was hopelessly overgeared to reach any decent speeds without the streamliner. He was by now 72 years old, and unfortunately, due to his advancing years and health issues, this was the very last time that Burt was ever able to compete at Bonneville. The bike remained in America, but Burt took the motor back with him as he had done many times previously. Burt continued to attempt to set records in New Zealand right up until 1975 using his test frame, but because of his failing health, his competition licence was eventually revoked. By this time, his motor was producing around 98 horsepower. He flew back to America in 1975 to install an engine in the bike which he'd built from parts, so he could sell it as a complete bike. I'm not sure if he might have been pulling a bit of a Swifty or not because he couldn't bring himself to part with his beloved original engine, but he was a bit of a scallywag. The amazing story of an old man and his motorcycle, as Burt called it, chasing an impossible dream was finally over. This was a very emotional time for Burt. I personally don't like this photo of Burt, as to me he looks like a broken man. He had a stroke in 1977, and even though he did make a recovery, he passed away 9 months later on the 11th of January 1978. To put in perspective what Burt achieved with his engine, he gained a 758% increase in power from his original Scout. Today's equivalent would be like buying a Suzuki GSX-R 600 and getting 948 horsepower from it. What a lot of people don't know is that not only did Burt have the world's fastest Indian, at that time he also had the world's fastest Velocette. But not only that, he also had the world's fastest tricycle. But that's for another video. Thanks for watching. Cheers.